Arvind Nandan is Executive Director, Consultancy Services. Cushman and Wakefield India Private Limited is responsible for leading the strategic consulting and development consulting verticals at C&W in India. A graduate in architecture with postgraduate diploma in business administration and Institute of Chartered Financial Analyst of India. He is member of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. He has worked with the real estate players in India and abroad for more than 11 years. Those words of introduction, I invite Mr. Arvind Nandan for his presentation on Budget 2013-14 highlights. Please welcome Mr. Nandan with a warm round of applause.
A very good afternoon to everybody. Before I start speaking on the budget highlights, I just want to relate a few things to the morning inaugural session. We had a very enchanting session, I believe, although it went on a little longer than planned. A couple of things which were very important, and I think the gentleman sitting here, you sir, raised a few points which were very relevant again. Look, first of all, in India what has happened is, we spoke a lot about real estate being treated in an unfair manner by the authorities, by RBI and many others. I think the problem is our authorities, our key agencies still have not developed a proper understanding of what real estate is. To them, to bring a very current example, real estate is somewhat like IPL, where most of us suspect there is something going wrong. We are not able to put a finger to it, and as soon as there is some spot fixing or something, we say, "Dekho, kuch gadbad ho raha hai." And that's exactly how real estate is also understood in our country. It's very much like that. But the problem is, it's not about not having a real estate regulator. It's not about the agencies not being interested in understanding real estate. I think the problem is we do not have a set code, a set of standards on how real estate should be looked at. And the first step, the first thing for that is having an understanding by the agencies of what real estate valuation is. We all speak of values, we all speak of price discovery, but to each his own understanding. I understand it the way I have learned it in the last 11 years, like she said, but I have worked for almost another 11 years in an allied industry. So for the last 22 years, I have somehow been related to this industry, and I find that every particular segment, every allied industry understands it in his own manner. It's like understanding an elephant by 4 or 5 blind men. Somebody who has touched the tail understands it as a tail. Somebody who has touched the trunk understands it as a trunk. So if we could really have a set valuation standards for this industry, I think we will make the first right step in correcting our perception. Otherwise, it is going to remain an industry which is very similar to how the film industry is. They keep crying that we want industry status, they are not getting it. We keep crying we want industry status, we will not get it. And because of this, because of lack of standards, because of lack of understanding, because of lack of a general perception, there is a lot of unscrupulous money that creeps into this sector. If you have certain defined codes, if you have proper champions, that is point number 2. These things will gradually, progressively these things will be eliminated. So agriculture, again, is a very fragmented, very loosely understood industry, but it has somehow been understood to a great extent. Whether Mahatma Gandhi was a champion or whoever was the champion, we don't know. But somehow it has come to a state where it is understood at least within some framework. Real estate needs that. Now let me come to the other aspect of the morning discussion. I was very keen to ask a few questions, but we were running out of time, so I thought I'll rather take this opportunity maybe for a couple of minutes. Creation of real estate is not just about cement mortar and creating buildings. The first step in creating real estate is having proper urban centers. Unfortunately, in our country, and I think Mr. Rana covered, Mr. Swaroop covered, everybody spoke about that. The first step in having urban centers is identifying the core economic activity. Now we don't even have to look outside to Sweden and to America and to anybody else. We have our own examples. In India, in 1950s, we created a few urban centers. Very fortunately, I grew up, spent 17 initial years of my life in one of those urban centers, which was freshly created, not a remodeled urban center, where a steel plant was put up. And at that time, probably we had a drive within our system to create those urban centers. Somehow the spirit has fizzled out completely, and now we are only adding more and more and more to Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore. In fact, what we've done in the last 5 decades is we have destroyed one metro, which is Calcutta. We have created a new one, Bangalore, and we are in the process of destroying it again. So to create new urban centers, we have to have new economic activity. That is where our manufacturing will also get a fillip. So that is happening in pieces. Ankleshwar and Jagadia is creating that. Now let's come to what is being laid down today for doing those things, and that's where the budget pronouncements get relevant. A budget actually is to be looked at in the manner we look at mathematics. A budget is not really something of a powerhouse in itself. It is only a tool, or maybe at best a toolkit or a guidebook, which tells us how things should be done, at least for 1 year, if not in the longer term. And therefore, it's important to understand what budget is saying, specific to an industry. So from that perspective, what I have done here is I have tried to cover key points related only to real estate or allied industries. There are other things like tax holiday to power sector and all, but that's not within the scope here. So I'll try and cover the points which will directly or indirectly impact real estate in our country based on this budget pronouncement. But just a quick background. See, in the previous year, there was some expectation from the economy. It was expected to grow at 5% or so, with agriculture, industry, and services expected to grow at certain rates. GDP growth had remained sluggish because of high inflation, and that was already accounted for. GDP growth rate was aimed at about 6.1 to 6.7%, while the nominal GDP rate was expected to grow at 13.4%, with an assumption on inflation rate. Now, this is what the background was in the previous budget was set. Incidentally, in this year's budget, the government has planned, the finance minister said that they've planned for a plan plus non-plan expenditure, that is total expenditure growth of about 16.1%, and a revenue receipts growth of all types, tax and non-tax, at about 21%. Now that is a very nice thing to hear. That's a very encouraging thing. But again, the problem is, if you look at previous few years examples, it is not something which really matches up. So that, in a way, may just fall short of expectations as we get closer to January, February next year. So that is an element of caution. When we look at the budget this time, what has happened is, because of impending elections in 2014, because of various other political and other socio-political factors, the budget has been viewed differently. Some people have called it a populist budget, although I don't completely agree with that. There may be some element of populism, but it was not entirely populist. There was certainly an element of caution, and I wonder if the government could have done any better in this current scenario than presenting a safe budget rather than a very ambitious and an aggressive budget. So, the key focus this time remained on investments from our industry perspective in infrastructure, rural and urban development, and industry, to aim for a GDP growth of at least around 7 to 8%. Key developments for real estate included, there was a pronouncement which said there will be a boost to affordable housing, particularly in tier 2 and tier 3 cities or peripheral areas or distant areas of the metros. There was a pronouncement regarding incentive to prospective buyers, which was stated by way of including an additional deduction of 1 lakh on loans of 25 lakhs. There was an increased fund allocation for rural housing loans and new fund allocation for urban housing funds. There was TDS on transfer of immovable property, which was pronounced, and abatement of service tax on high-end housing. So in summary, these were the things which were directly concerning real estate that were brought in. There were many areas which were not covered, like SEZs, and a few other things were deferred. But by and large, this is what it pronounced and gave. Let's look at things sector-wise. That makes it a little easier to decipher what the budget was saying or it was laying down. First of all, infrastructure sector. When we speak of urban development or creation of new growth centers, it will happen only if we lay our focus on infrastructure first of all. So what are the key points here? The first thing is about 5.5 million crore proposed investment in the infrastructure sector. That was a positive thing. IDFs, infrastructure debt funds, would be encouraged to provide long-term, low-cost funds. A vague pronouncement, but a pronouncement nevertheless, which looks positive. Some institutions were allowed to issue tax-free bonds to raise finance of up to 50,000 crore. Again, not enough, but at least a start. And proposed regulatory authority to address challenges faced to develop road infrastructure. One last thing regarding this is 5,000 crore funding to National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development, NABARD, for setting up logistic network. Now this, although may not very directly impact real estate growth, but it certainly has a long-term effect on creating attendant institutions, attendant elements like logistics, warehousing, cold storage units, which are eventually the catalyst for development. So the net impact of all this is that, as we perceive, is it will result in the development of strong infrastructure in the longer term, not in the short term, and help increase connectivity. Now that is something which has always been lacking in our country. For a country as densely populated, as ambitious as us, it requires a multi-fold increase in its infrastructure development, particularly road and surface transport. And therefore, this is probably a right step in that direction, although much short of what it could have been. And allocation to NABARD, like I said, is certainly another long-term step. Next, related to that is, there was some focus pronounced on development of industrial corridors. DMIC particularly has been in the picture for some time. The budget pronounced that there are plans for 7 new cities to be created and constructed on two new smart cities. This is something which is limited in its scope, and there is greater requirement, which they also tried to address by stating that similar corridors between Chennai, Bangalore, and Bangalore, Mumbai to be developed. Now, there is no timeline, there is no clear pronouncement, and I'm sure there are other agencies which are working on it. The only unfortunate part is after the budget, by the time the agencies come out with some kind of a policy or some kind of a pronouncement, it's a little too late in the day. What we saw last year was there was a pronouncement in the budget about ECBs. By the time RBI came out with a policy, it was 17th of December, and the deadline for raising the funds that they said was up till March 2013. So practically they left only 3 or 3.5 months for different funding houses to raise those funds, and therefore there was a bit of back and forth on that. Hopefully it will be carried forward, but things could be expedited a bit here. On the social infrastructure front, the budget said about 18.5% increase in allotment for JNNU RM, with a total allocation of about 14,873 crores. Plus, support for municipalities looking at PPP projects that convert waste into energy. While the first point is a little more impactful, I believe the second point is more critical, and that's more like a lifeblood for survival of our urban centers and therefore for development of real estate. PPP projects are something which have been clearly experimented with very successfully across the globe, and this is something where we must put a lot of our force at the local level, and probably they are right saying here that it's at the municipality level, because it is at that level that it can be developed. At the central level, it is again going to remain hanging in the air like the earlier speaker spoke, and that doesn't get implemented. So this is a net, again, a long-term pronouncement, something which will impact positively, but we don't see anything happening immediately here. Now, residential real estate, that is something which is the closest to our hearts. A gentleman sitting there had raised a question saying, how's the end user a stakeholder? I agreed with the answer that end user is actually the biggest stakeholder. In any trade, a buyer will always remain a stakeholder, just because the trade will not be completed unless the buyer is there. Only supply will not make up a business complete. So a supply and a demand side both put together make a business complete. What have they done for the demand side or the end user is a little bit, not much, and probably it will benefit only people in a very small proportion in smaller places, is that they've allowed an additional deduction of 1 lakh interest for first-time house buyers. So the focus is to somehow empower those people who don't yet have a house. and it will be applicable for a loan of up to 25 lakhs only, which clearly tells us that this is not going to change anything in the large urban centers of India. It's probably going to help only in tier 3 kind of places, because even in tier 2 today, it's almost impossible to buy a house for 40, 50 lakhs, or you will get it in far-flung locations. So therefore, it's probably aiming to develop or empower people in tier 3 and lower locations with that clause. And the current exemptions, of course, are set to continue. However, the developers can gather some strength here if they are really willing to participate in the urbanization process, in the process of feeding the demand, which is a massive demand in our smaller towns in hinterland. Therefore, there is an opportunity there. Further, an increase of 37% of the funds allocated under Indira Awas Yojana for rural housing, a total allocation of 15,184 crores. An increase of 50% allocation for rural housing fund with a total allocation of 6,000 crores. New urban housing fund to be set up by NHB with a grant of 2,000 crores. This we believe is a little important, although a little tricky also, and I'll come to that a little later. Plus a reduction in service tax abatement by 5% for luxury houses mostly, which is houses that have a carpet area of 2,000 square feet or more, or that have a total price tag of INR 1 crore. Now, increased allocation of funding is likely to cater to economically weaker and more vulnerable sections. But the problem here is all these steps are pretty much indirect. They are not really coming to help anybody in the immediate term. So like I've been saying throughout, probably we will see the impact if these things are carried forward in a few years' time. Probably not during the current 1-2 years or next 15-24 months. And of course, a reduction in abatement charges is expected to deliver a little more revenue. But let's see how it goes, because like I said right in the beginning, we don't have a valuation standard, we don't have a reporting or an audit mechanism where you can really determine what is being transacted at what price. On the taxation side, and that's one of the last few things, there was no revision in tax for income tax except a tax credit of 2,000 for those earning between 2 to 5 lakhs. Of course, there was some pronouncement regarding senior citizens and very senior citizens as well. Additional surcharge of 10% only for 2013-14, so that is applicable to this period, on those whose taxable income is more than 1 crore a year. Well, this is in a way not going to have any major impact or not going to create any major ripples, even though it's applicable for a short term. Application of TDS on 1% of transfer value of immovable property of 50 lakhs or more. Of course, agricultural land being exempted. What it does is it's meant to ensure more transparency and ideally wants to curtail black money in the transactions. However, it's likely that the opportunistic sellers, I don't want to use the term unscrupulous ones, may increase the cost or do something or play with the environment that we have in the lack of any particular mechanism. And this is most likely going to be passed on as a price increase. So we don't know if the impact is going to be the way it is intended at the policy pronouncement level. And finally, excise duty on marble has been increased from 30 to 60. I remember Maharashtra government in the last year's budget, had also done something. There was a lot of hue and cry that it will substantially increase the input prices, which is true. But that alone is not going to be a big enough deterrent on the pricing. There are much bigger, much larger factors. So in fact, that impact is certainly there, but it's not there to an extent. So it's been cleverly done. So I think that's an okay point. It definitely leads to an increase in revenue if properly followed up, and it's not going to burden the payer to a great extent. The buyback of shares is proposed to taxed at 22.66%. So that is not something which is going to sort of impact the tax, the shareholders in being taxed further. Surcharge on companies' taxable income exceeding 100 million, 10 crores. That has been proposed at the rate of 5% for foreign companies, 10% for domestic companies. And surcharge on DDT, dividend distribution tax, has been proposed to be increased to 10%. It can have a little bit of impact on the outgoings of the companies. But again, like I said in the beginning, they've been cautious enough to make it not too burdensome, not too cumbersome. There's an amendment proposed to Section 90 of the Finance Act 2012, wherein tax residency certificate in prescribed form is now mandatory for claiming treaty benefits. It's necessary, but not a sufficient condition. That's what the view is. It adds to regulatory compliances and complications also, and can have some negative effect on companies making investments through tax havens. So in a way, this is an attempt at clearing that particular chicken neck which has been existing regarding investments or funding from tax havens. Let's see how the impact is. And GAR, which has been a big sore thumb in the last 1 year, they have very promptly deferred it now for 3 years and said it will come only in 2016-17, just to boost a little bit of confidence in the investor community, in the international corporate community, so that the investors are relieved for the moment. Otherwise, it was becoming one major obstacle in the whole scenario. So, in a nutshell, that's what the budget has given us, particularly for this sector, which is not too much. The sorely or conspicuously missing points have been about the SEZ. There's been absolutely no pronouncement about that. A few other things that people were expecting, but none of that has come. And we will have to wait at least a year more to see if there's any further progress on that. Finally, if I were to sum up, what it has still done, the budget is, it has at least laid down a priority for infrastructure and manufacturing, and attempted to restore a balance in the economy, particularly after a very wobbly 2012-13. The government also is trying to focus on restoring credibility and putting fiscal targets in line with expectations. However, like I said in the beginning, it can be a little over ambitious. The last 2-3 years performance, particularly on the receipts and the revenue front, don't really match up with excuse me, with what's being proposed. And yeah, there's of course a commitment being shown to improving communication on taxation and regulatory policies. Let's see, our red tape mechanism is so long and so huge that we certainly don't know whether these pronouncements will actually be able to implement those things very clearly. Well, the areas which were sorely left behind and which could have probably been touched upon a little bit was a firm talk about real estate regulator, which we heard so much about today, and land acquisition act, which my friend just covered. We could have had some progress on that. I know it's still in the parliament, it's still being debated. Let's see whether it sees the light of the day or not. There was absolutely no pronouncement, nothing which could have given us some idea about how transparency could be established in this sector. Like I've been saying at all forums that I speak at, India does need a set of codes. We compare ourselves with China. China has had a valuation code and a national book for valuations for the last 15-20 years. It's a much larger economy. Of course, it's easy for them because all lands belong to the government, so they don't have those many complications. But still, if you want to organize a sector, you must have codes in place. And hopefully, at some point in time in future, our own policymakers will realize and lay down something for that. Concessions on MAT and DDT taxation on SEZs, again, complete silence, complete dark. And recognition of real estate as an industry, much like film industry, is just not forthcoming. So net, the budget has tried to take a step forward, but at times it seems that while taking a step forward, it has also taken a step back. So it's more or less where it had been. However, it's been trying to build some positive sentiment by providing those little bit or tidbits of positivities here and there. much because of compulsions that they've faced, much because of many other problems that they've faced in the last couple of years, and because of the elections that are coming up. So overall, that's the view on the budget. If there are any points, any questions, any thoughts, I'm happy to listen to them.